Just
Hang on.
I wonder if they can you edit them in? Too much trouble to edit them in.
Sterling, we're on the air. This
Okay.
is Jim Fetzer on the Fetz Presents, where I'm very pleased to have for my guests tonight two experts on the death and replacement of Paul McCartney. Sterling Harwood, who is both a J.D. and a Ph.D., interestingly, in philosophy. He continues to teach, though he's retired from the practice of the law. And Clare Kuehn, who's a longtime student of this issue and who was perhaps the very first to bring it to my attention as a real live issue, where Clare and I have had lots of exchanges over the years. Now, Sterling has just published a new book about this. So we're gonna, there we go. Very good. The Greatest Mystery of the Beatles. There's a subtitle, Sterling. You want to read it?
Critical Thinking on Paul is Dead and the Skeptical 60s. I have 4 chapters. One's on Paul is Dead. The next one is on the moon. Actually, it's on JFK, and then the moon landings, and then the Vietnam War. So the 60s, those of us who lived through the 60s were pretty skeptical, a lot of us, about whether Paul died and was replaced. And then that blew up in 1969. And then there was actually a November 1969 skeptical article in the LA Free Press on Neil Armstrong's lunar landing. And then the JFK assassination, of course, 1964 Warren Report. People were very critical of that early on. And then the war, everybody was skeptical of that at the end, I think. So I guess there were a few defenders. But we had to beat a hasty retreat in the 70s. But all through the 60s, it was a source of increasing Pentagon Papers and everything, increasing skepticism. So that's the 4 chambers of the heart of the 60s, Jim and Claire. The 4 chambers of the heart, the 4 chapters, 4 skeptical things: the war, the Beatles, JFK assassination, and the moon landing. So the 4 big events, 4 of them anyway.
So give us a thumbnail sketch of each of your argument or position in each of the chapters.
Claire. Well, there's a lot of evidence, objective evidence, for Paul being killed, and of course, if he was killed, he was replaced, because he was still apparently around all the way until the breakup, till he broke it up on April 10th, 1970, with his statement with the release of his album McCartney, fine album, by the way. And so there's 166 clues. I think I have the record. Claire's got some that I don't have yet. And there may be a few in the book by Tina Foster. It's a 502-page book. So, but I think I counted them up, and I've got more than she does. 166 clues that you really can't account for any other way, except that the Beatles were planting them. There's just too many of them, and they're too obvious. It's hard to deny them all. And then, although the Beatles always denied that they planted any Paul is dead clues. And so my thumbnail sketch on that one is there's physical evidence, and there's clues in the artwork and in the songs, including backwards, playing the song backwards.
Well, when I said thumbnail, Sterling, when I said thumbnail, all I meant was
and then
Paul died and was replaced. Okay, now you got 3 other chapters to tell us about JFK. Go ahead.
Right, I was just moving to JFK. So JFK was killed by a conspiracy. I think there's at least 2 shooters. I think you think there were more shooters than I do. 2 shooters is enough within 8 seconds or less to get you. And there's just a huge wound in the back right top of the head. Can't be an entrance wound, because Oswald was not using frangible bullets.
You think Lee Oswald was a shooter?
No, I do not. But I'm saying the official story, even if you go with what they're saying, doesn't allow for a big exit wound in the back of the head like that, because he was shooting from the upper right rear of the limo. And so there's a conspiracy there. The moon landings, I think there's reason to doubt that too. There's actually on Apollo 15, if you go that late, there's a very nice link in my Kindle version of my book. You click on the link and you'll see the flag waving in Apollo 15. And there's no atmosphere on the moon, so that should not happen. And if you're going to fake Apollo 15, and then Neil Armstrong made a lot of cryptic remarks too that we can get into, but bottom line is there's serious evidence that the lunar landings were faked, and there was patriotic reason to do so. And the final one is the war, and just people became more and more skeptical about whether that war was even winnable. And of course, the motivations for fighting the war.
And you're talking about Vietnam, right, Sterling?
Yeah, the war of the four hearts of the '60s.
Right,
so
right,
the big war we fought in the '60s. You know about it because you served in this war, I believe. So you were.
Well, I was never in country, but I was in the Marine Corps. Yeah, from '62 to '66
during the war period. Yeah, I understand if you volunteer during the war. Of course, maybe you were not conscripted, I don't think, but
no.
My daughter joined the Navy, and if you volunteer during wartime, you get a special ribbon that she got because we're still at war, I guess, in Afghanistan.
Sure, it's a national service ribbon, yeah.
Yeah, so you must have gotten one of those if you volunteered. So, but maybe you were conscripted.
Not a big deal. It simply meant you could have been sent.
Yeah.
I was not drafted. No, I was in the Navy regular program. The Navy paid for my college tuition and books and so forth in return for my agreeing to serve a minimum of 4 years as an officer in the Navy or the Marine Corps, and I chose the Marine Corps. So
yeah.
It's a wonderful program because my dad couldn't have afforded to send me to Princeton, and that was really the making of my entire life, the intellectual development that occurred there. Where I was Sterling, unbeknownst to me at the time, Princeton was #1 in the world in math, physics, and philosophy.
Yeah, they had a good department.
Yeah, and of course, I did my undergraduate thesis for Carl G. Himmel, who is the most influential philosopher among professional philosophers in the world. Karl Popper was more influential among natural scientists, and Thomas Kuehn would be among social scientists, but
yeah, we got the philosophical connection with Clare too, because I think you're an offspring of a philosopher, are you not, Clare?
I am. Yeah.
You were the fruit of the loins of a philosopher.
Clare, I don't think I ever knew that. Sterling's book is now like #1 on Kindle in the area of the Beatles. Give us just your take in general about all these issues.
Okay, well, in terms of my upbringing and background, I was steeped in philosophy of science and logic since I was born. So because my mother was very, very engaged in that world, and also in history, art, theater. I mean, she was interested in things, right? She was interested in different ideas. She would read things and say, that was really interesting. I don't know if it's right. I know it's not supposed to be right, but boy, that was some argument. So she was always giving us that sense of things. My father too, I mean, he was a historian, his MA and almost PhD, didn't quite finish it, was in the 17th and 18th century French history. So he was studying in the basement of the Sorbonne in Paris, taking documents that hadn't been seen since the French Revolution, when they were scarfed there against what were in fact early radical Marxists. So he was looking at Cardinal Richelieu's little handwritten notes. I come from that. So like when it comes to generally asking questions, knowing that ideas are okay and things can sound really weird, but they can be true or they can be not true, but you should always really work at them. That's my parents. My formal education was far sparser because I just didn't really feel the need to keep going. So I did my BA in medieval studies and history. I did it in order to have sort of a classical degree and multidisciplinary studies, because I just wasn't interested in only one thing forever and that's it, because I just already had that background. Can you hear me? Because I'm getting some.
We can hear you, Claire.
Oh, I heard some background. Like I don't know. what that
Sterling
was.
Yeah,
just heard his camera. He had a
I-
little background noise. Just
Oh,
continue.
okay. I wasn't sure if it was
yeah.
somehow me and a feedback.
My wife has entered the building.
Okay.
Elvis has left the building, but my wife has entered.
So, yeah, you were talking about for Paul. I mean, I spent from 2008 to about 2010 dealing with you, Jim, mostly on the Kennedy assassination, 9/11, Fort Hood, if anyone remembers that ridiculous situation. Learning these things and actually going very, very cautiously and skeptically from one to the other because I had the common sense to try out anything. That actually isn't what most people think is common sense, but it is an informed common sense. But I was very reluctant with each new case. I'm like, okay, not another one. Well, I mean, so I would apply the theory, meaning the higher end theory level to each new case or theory and learn it. And of course, the Zapruder film, the faking of the Zapruder film is absolutely key in the Kennedy assassination. Without knowing that, you don't know it wasn't 8 seconds. You don't know that it wasn't, people weren't where they said they were. Or I mean, people were often where they said they were, but they weren't where they were in the film. And the optics work that you did with John Costella, because he's an optics specialist. To me, that allowed me to say to my mom before she died, no, I actually know this. Like, I'm not going to sit there anymore and say, well, maybe, and I've always got to stay open. And no, this is optics. This film was faked on any planet. So that started me in to say, all right, not everything is real, but some of it is. And I ended up looking into getting a smattering of all the main conspiracy theories, some of the sub stuff, reading thousands of hours of stuff for 2 years. And then I decided to look into Paul or Flat Earth. That was going to be my thing. I was going to write a debunking on Paul or Flat Earth. Paul's dead. And I thought, well, Flat Earth is all the science stuff, and I know some of it, but I think I'll do Paul's death, because that just couldn't be, but I always thought there was something wrong with the later Paul figure. So I'll just see, show people why they can get things wrong. Well, as I delved into it, I very quickly realized that there was too much of it, as Sterling has said, about not only the art clues, but also the actual history was gotten wrong. The details of what people said was wrong. And all I had to do then was say, why do some photographs confuse me and some do not? And it comes down to photo doctoring, distortion, and also a certain amount of likeness that was achieved for about 2 years. So when I figured that out, that was it. I knew Paul had died, and I've been working ever since to expose it.
All right, let me, all of us, I believe, agree that in fact, Paul McCartney did die in 1966 and was replaced by someone I would argue was an even better musician. But I'm interested in having each of our takes on how he died. Sterling, why don't you go first? What do you think are the circumstances of Paul's death as you understand them?
Well, I don't think he was murdered, although if he was murdered, that would explain a lot, because, why do you need to cover it up? I mean, a lot of bands have somebody die, even one of the major figures in the band die, and their sales go up, and they could have hired Eric Clapton and Stevie Winwood or something to replace him, or Billy Preston or something. So why would they fake his death, or not fake his death, but cover up his death? And so, but if one of the Beatles or one of the big pieces in the Beatles story, like George Martin or somebody, I think the more likely thing was that John Lennon flew off the handle, the way some people, Alvin Goldman says John Lennon killed Stu Sutcliffe by getting into a fight with him and kicking him in the head, and he ended up with a brain hemorrhage. But if John killed Paul, then that would make sense to cover it up, because you don't want John to get in trouble, as well as losing Paul. Then, there goes your Beatles right there. So, but I kind of think he was not murdered. It's more likely to be an accident, but then there's a lot of trouble that they went through to cover it up. You got to, get the body before some official does, or bribe the official, or threaten the official. So there is a possibility in my mind that Paul opted out because he seemed to have had some kind of nervous heart condition or something, and there was a lot of threats against the Beatles after John's "We're Bigger Than Jesus" remark, and they ended their touring days, and they were roughed up in Manila, and things were just getting really wild. And of course, later on, George Harrison was attacked and stabbed 10 times in the chest, and John was shot 5 times with hollow point bullets in the back. So, it got pretty hairy there. So maybe Paul saw some of that coming and just said, I'm opting out. Let's just replace me. I'll still write the music, and maybe I'll show up once in a while in the studio. That's not totally, I can't totally rule that out, because as you say, the follow-up guy, Billy, that a lot of people call him, Billy Campbell or Billy Shears, he seems to be more talented than the original, or at least as talented. And it's awfully hard to replace a Paul McCartney, because he was great up through the Revolver album. You have Yesterday and For No One and Here, There, and Everywhere, and just one amazing song after another. It's hard to replace somebody like that, and to do it on such a short time frame. From the 2 death dates that people talk about are September the 11th, 1966, or November the 9th, 1966, because there's an 11-9 kind of numerology that appears if you put a straight edge mirror up against the center of the drum skin in the Sgt. Pepper album cover on the front. So you get X 111X he die when you put that in there. And so some people interpret the I, the Roman numeral I, and the X as 11-9, but if you do it the European way, it'd be the reverse. So it'd be 9/11 to us Americans. So we put the month first, but the Europeans put the day first. So there's been arguments about that. I tend to go with the November the 9th date. It apparently was raining that day in London, so he might have gotten into a car accident, and then they covered it up. But it's kind of unmotivated why they would bother to risk criminal charges for fraud or suppressing a death report or something. So maybe if one of them actually killed him, and Lennon did have a pretty serious temper. He got into fights when he had his lost weekend with Harry Nilsson, and started heckling the Smothers Brothers in L.A. during the period when he was away from Yoko Ono, and there are pictures of him getting in fisticuffs. And he makes some comments like he was pretty cruel early on. So that might explain why they would cover it up. And the other reason they would cover it up is if he just kind of, like Syd Barrett, he just went crazy. So if Paul just took LSD and went crazy or something, then you could see, and he did take LSD for the first time. I think he said he took it 4 times, or at least the replacement for Paul said that Paul took it 4 times. So if he had a nervous breakdown or something, or he had a disfigurement in the accident that he didn't want people to see him, because, a lot of movie stars and rock stars are vain, that might explain, he might even still be alive. It's just a possibility. But there are these physical differences, and there's a lot of clues in there. And there's no motivation for the clues unless they're trying to report that he actually did die. So that's and they always deny that the clues were there, but they're clearly there. In fact, John Lennon sings on Glass Onion, "Here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul." So he was actually openly referring to the clues.
Well, thank you, Sterling. That was really quite a fascinating range of alternatives that you've contemplated at one point or another. Clare,
well, yeah, I wasn't there when he died. I wasn't there when he died, so I don't have any personal knowledge, of course.
We know lots of things we didn't observe personally, of course, as you well know.
Right.
Clare, why don't you just give us a fairly comprehensive account of how you think his death came about?
Okay. There are always a few basic set points that have to be recognized in a case, and what I find is that Sterling in his book and here is not recognizing most of those set points. So what happens is if you don't get a few things straight, now again, those are decisions, but they are interactive set points. They happened historically. They are people's psychological nature. They are a good sense of the people, which clues, if we're talking art clues or any form of clue, which ones will be primary, which ones will be secondary, which are supportive, right? But which support is important. Okay, so basically what I need to do is basically say, first of all, John flew off the handle, but John and Paul were, and I wish I had my pictures, incredibly close to the point of, I mean, just soulmates, best friends, together all the time. You could say in love. If people don't understand that as just sexually interested, they were in love. They were often giddy and interactive. There was not the same tension as with Stu Sutcliffe. I mean, I actually agree that Stu's sister probably does have the right story there, that there was quite a lot of sexual tension. There was other things going on, according to John's friend Pete Shotton, that he had to comfort John over because John felt he was going gay because Stu was engaging him in some sex acts. So there was a lot of stuff going on in the Stu years that was not happening between John and Paul. It's just John and Paul were besties. I mean, they were beyond besties, and it's John Paul's capacity for music making is far deeper than Bill's. Now that doesn't mean you can't say that Bill has talent, but the depth of those early songs, they are like little jewels. They are the two boys, and of course George to some degree, and a little bit less so Ringo, were constantly designing songs. They were like little crystalline perfections. They're simple on the surface, and they have so many layers of complexity that they're actually complex. All of that goes out the window when Paul dies. That doesn't mean that there isn't still personality and talent that John and George especially demonstrate later, but it's quite different. So if we look at that set point, it just creates a terrible difference between the two periods. Now, in terms of what happened, we would have to get into the date clue a bit more, other evidence for exactly when the date is. November 9th is too late because Paul is gone for several months. John was actually not in England, anywhere near Paul, during those 2 months. He's actually gone for film. And he's immediately sad and absolutely distressed in his early Strawberry Fields Forever writing in October, November 1966. Bill appears in film about late November, early October, or late November to December 1966. So he's already there then. The other thing to get straight about this is basically the Beatles couldn't do this, wouldn't do this, wouldn't think it up. Doubles are done by political operatives, they're done by intelligence services. They are usually for protection. There can be, of course, there can be a film double for, safety reasons. The early reference to this stuff is in print in February 1967, and it was a disclaimer. And so it was a disclaimer to the previous month to throw you off. But there obviously was already a rumor going around, and that disclaimer wasn't discovered until the 1990s. So this wasn't for money to set stuff up. I mean, there's Grizzly, it's extreme grief. John is aggrieved immediately. And also, Paul didn't tend to take hard drugs. He would take the uppers and downers. One of the things was that he complained he didn't want to be taking LSD. He was furious that they had laced the drinks. So he was actually a rebel in that regard. So to get to know Paul means to at least begin to know some of the detriments about Bill, who seems to be a political operative, who was brought in, and who's been protected. I mean, that kind of thing can't be run by a band and their corporation. So to get those sorts of big things set, you know it's bigger than like John killed Paul. I mean, it's just no way. There's no heart way to say that happened. And Paul didn't really have a heart problem. So there you go.
Claire, I was asking you, what is your take on what happened, which you have not addressed? Oh,
okay. So what you mean, like on the day?
Yeah. How did he die? Okay. That's what I'm asking. Okay.
Well, with those set points in mind, then the only evidence we have is for something to do with a car impact. So various people who are, I think, very familiar with the case have suggested that that was a scenario, and actually it was set up to look that way so that the Beatles would think it was a car impact, and then we get into murder. So if he had his brains, shot, but in front of a car, or they set it up, then the Beatles would think that. One way or the other, the only evidence we have is around for damage to the body and car. So you have like this association of car with the damage, but it may not be that he was in fact killed in a car crash. I actually think it happened on the 13th, UK time around midnight. I think that the date clue it's the last piece to fall in a whole set of historical arguments. But anyway, Paul probably went to the Melody Maker Awards. There's this big award ceremony. It was claimed he had gone on the 13th. The way that cover-ups work is they usually find one thing to lie about really early. So if he had gone on the 12th or 11th, like in other words, if he just before that he had gone, then there would be an announcement later in the week of who had won. It was a secret, and Paul died, and they could say, oh no, he was alive at those Melody Maker Awards. That's very likely. Now, in terms of the date clue, what happened was, and I can't find it now, but there was a radio show in late 1969 when the rumor was supposed to have occurred, but it actually occurred when Paul died, of course. And the date clue was actually leaked as being a date clue. So they suggested it was there. This was a US radio show. And George Harrison was on there, and he said, he kind of affirmed that there was kind of maybe a date clue there. And what they did is they suggested it was a date clue, but they divided it. So instead of what the actual thing says is an I, an O, an N, an E, an I, then a caret, like, one of those little things go up, then a he die, all in caps. So it's an I, O. So it reads as 111, sorry, I1, IX, he died. That's how it reads. Or you could say 111X, he died. What the suggestion was that the first two, so the I and the ONE, they are in Arabic numerals, and then the I and the X are to be read as Roman numerals, which actually splits it between two alphabetic systems and isn't quite natural. And then he died. Okay, so now it turns out that Paul was a number 13. He had 4 letters, 9 letters. Okay, so 13, he died. If you flip the IIIX to be XIII and take it as all Roman, 1111 is what the Romans would have said. So 111X would have been X111 flipped, and it's 13, he died, or Paul McCartney, he died. Okay, but it also fits with and taking this piece down and stop to divide it as 11 and 9 and say it's 111X, and the later Beatles got into Crowley because of Bill and his creepiness, really creepy guy, okay? But the Crowley stuff is to flip satanic reversals. So it's partly for a clue, like to hide it even more, but it's also for satanic reversals. So you'd have 111X, which is how the Romans would say it, 111X, he died, 13, he died. Now the other support for this is that the very night that 13 was a Tuesday, and John did sing. Now you can take it as he was covering up and it wasn't a Tuesday, but he said "Stupid Bloody Tuesday" in one of his very early songs, which is I'm the Walrus. So "Stupid Bloody Tuesday" might be a Tuesday. The 13th of September was a Tuesday. And also the final point here just to mention is that there was a news flash that went around the world the very night of the 12th, 13th, so UK time, that right around midnight. And that news flash was that a Beatle had been injured in a car accident, more news at 11, and then it developed to a Beatle was dead in a car accident. It was Paul, more news at 11. That went around the world. It was in Australia, it was in the BBC, it was in the US, but the BBC wasn't on at that time. So what we have is very likely a very real mistaken news leak right at that point. And I would say that the argument for murder is a much higher end conspiracy issue. If he was murdered, then indeed many people high up knew. And one of the things is you have predictive programming in the Monkees pilot show. The Monkees pilot show was several weeks before its main release, and it occurred exactly when that news flash went out. So the news flash happened and the pilot show was running. And what was the pilot show about? Murdering Paul. That's what it was about. It actually used Davy Jones, who was the only English member of the New Monkeys band, group, takeover, plot, U.S. intelligence, whatever, okay? Davy Jones is the one who's about to be murdered at midnight. And it aired 30 minutes after midnight UK time. So during one of its commercial breaks, as it's building up this plot about the murder of the equivalent to Paul, out comes a news flash. And in those days, a news flash, if people are really young and don't know, it was an announcement that there would be news later. Nobody was taping their shows. This was something that was just announced. So what you have is a historical news flash announcement. You have the Monkeys show right at that point. You have the occurrence of the UK time. You have the immediate cover up with the Melody Maker Awards lie, and it was very awkward early on. You have all of the things going wrong at that point, and you also have the date clue now fitting. If you read it, 111X or IIIX, Roman numerals flipped. So that's sort of my
Claire, forgive me. Forgive me. Did you actually say how it happened?
Yeah, like some kind of a car
accident.
Some car incident.
Some kind of
head trauma. Yeah,
okay.
head trauma.
There was head trauma. Well, okay.
You both.
You're talking about the details to the body. So the only details we have is that the right eye was bulging, the left eye was squished.
Claire, thank you. You've both overwhelmed me in different ways.
Okay.
For me, I mean, by comparison to what the two of you have laid out here is going to sound pretty simple and straightforward. My understanding is the following. They were having a session and they got in an argument. Paul left in a huff. It was raining. As he drove along, there was a young lady stuck in the rain. He gave her a lift. Her name might or might not have been Rita, but she was so excited to find herself in the car with Paul McCartney that she threw her arms around him. He ran a light and was hit by a truck, trapped in the car. She got out, it burst into fire, and he died in the accident. Now, only a few people knew initially, and they were able to cover it up. Why? For the sake of the band. This is a billion-dollar industry. Who would know what the future of the band would have been had the fans all known that Paul, who was, of course, a founding member with John, I mean, they were the core of the Beatles, had died. Ringo gave a confession that was published in a kind of a shell publication, but which I believe is authentic, asked, what about the band? And they decided that they would try to find a sub, and he just worked out so well that they decided to continue to use him. And it was the person I take you're referring to as Bill, namely William Shepherd or Billy Shears, because sheep who tend their flock, the sheep are sheared. So it's a nickname for William Shepherd. And in fact, we have him introduced by the Beatles in the Sgt. Pepper album as the one and only Billy Shears, where the cover is clearly a funeral for Paul. There's a left-handed guitar on the funeral mound. You have the four lads from the Madame Tussauds waxwork. They're all noticeably about the same height as indeed they were in life. And then you have the resplendent Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And it was at this period when they began to wear mustaches, their hair long and so forth, to make it more difficult to determine that, in fact, this person who was now cast in the role of the fourth Beatle was not actually Paul. He was substantially taller. There are other features we can discuss, but that this is the reason why, and I think the date was 9/11, it was September 11, that their manager canceled their concerts in October, which would have been absurd had he still been alive. He said, well, it's because they couldn't hear themselves play. Well, they could hear themselves play in any session they wanted. They don't go out and give live performances with 100,000 adoring fans because they want to hear themselves play. So it was an absurd explanation, but they were acutely aware that, you know, Paul's absence or that he was being replaced, and exactly how rapidly this sequence took place of finding the right guy is not completely clear. But in December, we have the appearance for what appears to be the first time in photographs, which Nick Kollerstrom picked up upon, of the replacement, whom I take to have been Billy Shears. I mean, that's just my broad encompassing.
May I say something just for the moment? Is that okay, Sterling?
Absolutely.
Okay. That story, Jim, has been around since 1969 when a student made it up. He was trying to make a storyline. It's not due to actually like the clue's structure overall. It's not due to the historical situation. John was not in, he wasn't anywhere near there. He was in Germany. And in terms of the photographs, the reality is that Bill is already in film. It wasn't available publicly, okay? But Mal Evans is filming from late November.
Just to make it clear, when you say Bill, you mean William Shepard.
Yeah, okay, so I mean William Campbell, and so this gets into the name, but there was a William Shepard who was a producer, and he seems to have done mimicking in London early on, in Liverpool. He was doing spoofs, or no, what do they call them? Spin-offs of Beatles songs to cash in. I mean, before they were really famous, they were famous locally. So that was William cover, yeah, and using cover bands probably for the actual singing. It was called the Mercy Beat Sound, and they were playing off that. So the William Shepard thing, you know, and the Shears is, many people now think that was Billy's Here, that it kind of sounds like Billy's Shear, like Billy's Here. But again, he does shear us like sheep. He has taken advantage of us like the walrus and the carpenter in the Lewis Carroll or Charles Dodgson books of Alice in Wonderland, who takes advantage of and eats the little oysters. It's a big lie. The Beatles wouldn't have been able, as I said, again, this is a thing, they wouldn't have been able to, wouldn't have been thinking of or covering up. I mean, they would not be managing Secret Service level international diplomacy. This kind of thing is far bigger and darker, and there are some hints about who Billy Campbell was, but it's hints. He seems to have maybe come from Scotland. He uses the Campbell tartan. He was reported in '69 as maybe being a Campbell, but he also says, I was Willie Campbell in one of his clues. He loves the Campbells. He's hanging out with the Campbells all the time. So he's probably William Campbell, but one way or another, he does like to use William or Bill in his clues. Other people call him William when they're kind of off the record. So yeah, William Campbell, Bill, Faul, Sir Paul, so that we can say it's not Paul, who was not just a cutie pie, but he certainly was a cutie pie and really natural and really had natural feelings and natural responses to most things. He wasn't a poser like Bill. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, Ixnay on the rainy night day.
Claire, you know, look, you've done a huge amount of research. You have your story.
Well, nothing personal. I was just saying.
I'm giving you my distillation, my take. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to refute you. I'm telling you.
No. I was joking. I was joking,
Claire,
like Ixnay.
Just
no, not at all. No problem.
Claire, just relax. Sterling, I want you to respond in any way you like to what Claire was laying out there.
Well, I agree with Claire that this guy named Wayne Labor was the guy who came up with that story. And he did it as a album review of the Abbey Road album. I think it was in the Drake newspaper for Drake University or something, or some college newspaper.
Drake was first, then it was Fred Labor. Drake was first, then it was Fred Labor later.
Yeah, and Labor made up, he admitted he made up the stuff. So he just thought it would be a kind of a spoof, like a college Harvard Lampoon type spoof. So
well, Sterling. I mean, you know, all this stuff about saying it was a spoof and made up. Maybe it wasn't. I mean, how do you know it was a spoof? Even if someone later says it was a spoof.
You're right.
The details.
Claire, just wait a minute. We got a story right now that's very authentic, in my opinion, about Hunter Biden. We got a photograph of him in bed. Claire? With a crack pipe in his mouth. There's a whole lot of corruption involved with Hunter Biden. I have no doubt this is 99% of this is true. But we've got Facebook, Twitter, and other social media. They're claiming it's misinformation, disinformation. They're banning it. They're doing their fact checking and saying it's not. So we know there are all these levels of denial and information. I don't think that it's a straightforward matter to sort these out. But Claire, I was asking Sterling now, okay? I want Sterling to have a chance here.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Sterling.
Oh, well, yeah, I agree that since the guy admitted this story was made up, that doesn't mean, it still could coincide with the truth, or maybe he's lying. But it's just the evidence for the detail. You seem to be asking about the details of the accident, or whether it was,
I was just asking each of you for your take about how he died. As a preliminary, you are going into all these other issues.
Well, car accident seems to be it, but then
Sterling, you froze up. Well, Sterling's getting unfroze, Claire. Go ahead. Say a few words.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the evidence doesn't give us those kinds of details. And that was from Fred Labour's story. So that's all I think he's emphasizing, is that the actual evidence is more about the state of the body and having a car, and of course the monkeys broadcast. That's key. It's the wrong date for November, and it's the wrong date for the 11th. So it could have been, but they weren't in the country. They weren't in the country together.
Sterling, we hope you're going to catch back up with us. It's almost certainly a bandwidth issue. He's going to come back in, Claire. That's all. He's going to come back in.
Yeah, so it's just a matter of what evidence we have versus the story that sounds like a fleshed out story, but knowing where it came from, and also not having it in the clue structure really, it's more likely that part of it was a way to get it across, right? That Fred Labour was trying to get it across. But absolutely, Fred Labour does seem to have, taken seriously to some degree the idea that Paul died. But
tell us about the difference between the two musicians and your take, because it's my opinion that his replacement was an even better musician, that he was born as a right-hand guitar player, had to learn to play left. Paul was born a left-hand guitar player, and he was, to my understanding, known as a man of 1,000 voices, and he could, imitate virtually anyone. I believe that the memoirs of Billy Shears is fundamentally a work of fact, not a work of fiction, and that there are just a mountain of details about what he actually lived through in giving up his own original identity. Just go ahead and pick up anywhere you want, Claire, until Sterling gets back, and then we'll give him a shot.
Sure. Well, the memoirs of Billy Shears, for people who don't know, was a book that came out in 2009, and then again, I believe last year, in a much expanded version. The basics of the case are the basics of the case. So in that sense, it is more fact than fiction. But it throws in all kinds of stuff that was floating around in forums. It was just bad ideas, unsubstantiated ideas. And it mostly pleads for loving Bill. So, the idea is, well, I was so hurt. I was so damaged by being a double, but I was really a Satanist involved in high-end Illuminati stuff, because that's also in it. We've long suspected that. And please love me. And, you might like Paul, but that was just silly stuff. That was just the early Beatlemania stuff. When you actually look historically at Bill, he seems to be very angry that Paul actually was so wonderful. Paul could play for minutes on end. He wasn't even looking at his fretboard. He was extremely melodic. He wasn't showy. He was loving and demonstrative. Demonstrative isn't showy. When you get to Bill, he sometimes hops around like a bunny rabbit, like literally is dorky. He likes to pick his nose on the camera, and I don't mean just put his finger up. He's done that, to show. He's kind of ugly sort of person underneath his superficiality a lot of the time. Doesn't mean he hasn't suffered. He drank himself silly in the 70s when the Beatles broke up. He, you know, obviously he suffered, but as an operative, he's, you know, made a deal. And, you know, what they did is they became a show art band rather than actually a musical band. So their music became mishmash.
That's of course your opinion, Claire. I think the music
right, but
is marvelous.
You stated
yeah,
your opinion straight
I know
up.
what I said. Now let me
I'm
ask
stating
you this.
my opinion straight
Let
up.
me ask
They were
you
an
this.
art band.
You were telling me of your conviction that Paul had died and been replaced for, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah.
Before I found a good reason to believe that he had died and been replaced, meaning I was looking for hard evidence that would show we're talking about two different people. And it was two Italian forensic scientists who published in Wired, Italian version of Wired magazine, who set out to disprove the hypothesis, but wound up confirming it because they found that among the other features, that Paul had bad teeth and a narrow palate, while Faul had, and Faul is for fake or false Paul, if anyone is unaware, while Faul had good teeth and a normal palate, that Paul had a roundish face, very boyish. Faul had a longer face and had much less of that youthful enthusiasm that just exuded from Paul from every pore. And of course, we know separately that we have photographs of Paul with Jane Asher, to whom he was engaged, where they were approximately the same height. We have other photographs, however, of Faul with Jane Asher, and he towers over her. He's at least 4 inches taller. So when we have persons who have different teeth, different palates, different heights, different shape of skull, we're clearly talking about two different people. It was this that convinced me that there really had been a replacement of Paul. And since, of course, I mean, I've done interviews with you and with Tina Foster and with Nick Kollerstrom especially, who's been, in my opinion, very good about tracking the photographic record. And by the way, just for the audience out here, I have done a piece about body doubles or replacements entitled False Fake News Issues of Identity. You can find right here at Jim the Conspiracy Guy. So if you go there, you'll find I give you how we know Lee Oswald was actually in the doorway of the book depository when the motorcade passed by, and therefore not only cannot have been the lone demented gunman, but cannot have been one of the shooters, of whom there appear to have been 8. I've identified 6 by the location, the shots they took, their name, rank, serial number. Only Damagard, a 7th, with which I agree. We've now discovered there is an 8th by the single tree on the grass opposite the grassy knoll. You wouldn't even think there's a location for a gunman there. But I've seen 2 different photographs of the shooter holding his rifle, one from Rick Russo, the other from another expert in JFK research, Ed Tatro. They're different photographs, but it's the same guy. He's the only of all of these shooters whose identity we do not yet know. But what's interesting here is each of them appears to represent one of the individuals or groups who are sponsoring the assassination.
Sure.
So one's a Dallas County sheriff, one is a Dallas police officer, another is an expert from the military, an Air Force expert, another is Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman, another is an anti-Castro Cuban, another is a representative of the Bronfman family, really basically an Israeli shooter.
Yeah, the Bronfmans.
Yeah. So,
story to have foisted those on the world.
This guy by the tree might have represented the Fed, but I mean, it's on that order is all I'm saying here now.
Yeah.
That's the very first case I talk about here. Then I look at Noah Posner, who is alleged to have been the youngest child who died at Sandy Hook, and show you how we explored the hypothesis that he actually was a photograph of the party that was supposed to be Noah's older stepbrother, Michael Wagner, when he was younger.
Right.
Or I asked Larry Rovira, who'd done brilliant work confirming that Lee Oswald was the man in the doorway by a superposition over the facial features of the figure in the
Right.
doorway to confirm it. And I sent him a photo of little Noah and a Michael Vabner without any context. He didn't know it had anything to do with Sandy Hook and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's the third. The second, and then the third is Faul, where you can find, a whole photographic record. So if you want to see what I'm talking about, including the forensic evidence, unfortunately, when we broadcast the way we're broadcasting, when I combine Zoom with Restream, if I use photos or try to, do a PowerPoint, it gets lost. I've had this problem before. So I'm just telling you where you can see all the photographic record. And then I did, in addition, you'll find Hillary Clinton has used about 8 body doubles, whereas she began using them after her collapse at the 9/11 memorial event. They took her back to Chelsea's apartment, and her crew were so concerned that the public might become anxious about her health that they sent out the first of a series of body doubles, who was younger, thinner, more attractive, much more pleasant. You knew for sure it wasn't
her ratings
Hillary,
went up during that period.
to whom I refer as the Meg Ryan double, because she looks no much like her. And then on a flight to Charlotte, North Carolina, just a couple days later, they had a shorter, heavier, with a more sloped forehead, I referred as the Meryl Streep double. But believe it or not, even during the debates, that was not Hillary Clinton debating either Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, but the best of the Hillary doubles, where they've invented a voice box that gives you a voice that is indistinguishable. And just to add the kicker to show that the Democrats aren't done with this mode of deception, when before Joe Biden came onto the stage to debate Donald Trump in the first, which may turn out to be the only presidential debate, we had received a series of reports. First, that he already had all the questions. Well, that happened with Hillary too. Donna Brazile, for example, was getting Hillary the questions in advance. And if she didn't get all the questions, she got very, very angry. I mean, some of her outbursts were really stunning. When she was asked a question she didn't know she was going to be asked. We also had a report that Joe Biden had an earpiece inserted into his skull that goes directly to his ears so he could receive transmissions from off stage without needing a wire. But, and in some ways, most intriguingly, we had a third report from a defecting staff member who reported that Biden's anti-dementia medication had the unfortunate side effect of inducing incontinence, so that they had staff meetings to debate what type of adult diaper Joe would be wearing that would be least visible and make the least crinkling sound when he urinated, leading me to observe that I believe he has a future after politics making commercials for the pens. Now, when the Biden team asked that there be breaks every 30 minutes. I mean, this is only a 90-minute event, but they wanted a break every 30 minutes. I knew that was to change his diaper. So when they denied that, when the Trump team turned it down, they turned to a Joe Biden body double. And let me tell you how we know it's a body double. Joe Biden's ears, and ears are as distinctive as fingerprints, have a lobe. In other words, you can see them curl in at the base. The body double has ears that connect directly to the side of his face. He does not have earlobes. The body double is a slightly fainter version, sort of a slightly wispier, more diminutive version of Joe Biden. He has a thinner face. Joe Biden has a smooth chin, but when he smiles, there's a small dimple. This guy has a major dimple, different. This guy was wearing a wire. This guy has brown eyes. Joe Biden has blue. So if you start looking at the advertising now for the Democratic Party candidate, you're going to find, even here, I got one right here that's talking about how Biden ran 33 years ago, Biden ran 13 years ago, and now Biden now. And the Biden of 33 years ago and of 13 years ago has an earlobe, but the Biden now doesn't. I mean, that just shows you how far they're going with all of this. So don't let yourself be played. It's really fascinating stuff. I mean, really fascinating stuff. And again, you know, the voice box enables you to have the voice. And when you hear the voice, and the voice is the same voice, you're inclined to believe it was the same person. Now, with Paul and Faul, of course, it's rather different because they don't look that much alike once you do comparisons of the kind that the Italian forensic scientists undertook. And I just say, just review what I have there, right there on Jim the Conspiracy Guy. You got, about 44 stories are up there, shows are up there. There are at least 4 more that will be added shortly. But I think it's like show number 36 or something. You'll find fake news, issues of identity, just to see all of this, these photographic comparisons we're talking about. Claire, I think you agree with me on all those photographic points I've been making, do you not?
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to disagree about Biden, but I really agree that we have a problem in the world where deceptions are run, and it's supposedly crazy to ask. Now, with Paul and Faul, Paul and Bill, the issue is that some of the photographs are absolutely impossible. It's not a slight difference or a possible little lighting difference on an ear or anything like that. We're talking something that's completely radically different, even given lighting and camera. So in other words, every person, and I guess I should say this for when Sterling is here, repeat it. Every person has a range of looks. Every person has surprising looks that happen under certain circumstances. But Paul and Faul's diverge. So in other words, you don't get the kinds of weird looks for Paul as you do for Faul. So they don't come together even in their outrageous examples. They're not convergent there. They're divergent. But you mentioned you mentioned something. Trying to remember, it was a while back.
I see, Sterling. I wasn't looking. I'm sorry. I'll bring you in. Sterling's waiting to rejoin us. Here he comes. Thank you.
Okay. Well, the only thing I'll say was just about how I actually came on your show in 2012 and did tell you about the Wired magazine article. Hi, Sterling.
We're glad
you didn't
to have you
about
back,
it.
Sterling.
I'm glad to be back. Can't
I'm
keep
sorry
a
I
good man
didn't see you
down.
knocking on the door.
Oh yeah, you can't keep a good man down.
I just have one question for Claire, and then I want to give you.
Sure,
I don't know if you've been able to hear what we've been saying.
No.
Okay. Well, I was going over the photographic abnormalities about the Italian forensic scientists who set off to disprove the hypothesis and wound up confirming it. But I was pointing out that I have a piece called Fake News, Issues of Identity, where I go through how we know Lee Oswald was in the doorway of the book depository when the motorcade passed by, how we know that the children at Sandy Hook were faked by using photographs of older children when they were younger, how we know that Hillary used body doubles galore, even during the debates with Bernie Sanders and with Donald Trump. And I was adding too that even Joe Biden, the guy who debated Donald Trump, was not actually Joe Biden, who has earlobes, his ears turn up, so he has distinct lobes. The guy has ears that connect straight into the side of his head, that he has a slightly narrower skull, that he's a bit of a diminutive version of Biden. He has brown eyes, Biden has blue. He had to wear a wire, but Joe already has a skull implant, so he doesn't need a wire. Wow. He also ties his tie differently. Biden ties it with a double Windsor, this guy with a single. And I was pointing out that even in literature right now, I mean, this comes from the Republicans, but they got a photograph of Biden running for president 33 years ago, and you can see the earlobe. There's a photograph of Biden running 13 years ago. You can see the earlobe. And then you got the Biden running now, and he no longer has an earlobe. And Claire was saying, while she could agree with most of what I was explaining, she was disagreeing about Biden. So my question was,
I don't know.
But have you even looked at the evidence, Claire?
Well, I was about to say when Sterling came back, I mean, I will go and look at the evidence. I'm just saying my personal take was not that, although I saw the Hillary situation and so on. So, I'm willing to look at anything. And then I was moving to the fact that you suggested that when I first came to you and told you about this for an hour or a year and a half, that I didn't mention the Wired magazine article. I did, but there was so much for you to absorb it took you yet another, 8 months or so to feel you had discovered that. But yeah, no, I knew about that in 2010 when I
Yeah, but
first
for
talked
some
to you.
reason you were discounting it. If you had brought that up to me in the beginning, I would have been immediately hooked on the issue. And frankly,
No, I
you
did.
weren't paying attention when Biden came out, so of course it wouldn't occur. He's a pretty good double, unlike many of Hillary's, which were not very good doubles. But Sterling, I want to invite you back in. We've been missing you, our friend. So go ahead.
Thank you.
Give us some further thoughts and reflections on these issues.
May I take a 2-minute break?
Sure, go
While
ahead.
He just begins? Okay, I'll be back.
Yeah.
You don't have to just leave your camera on. Just take a break.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay, well, the ear evidence, when I first heard about it, there's ear evidence for Paul McCartney, too. And
yes,
that Bill and the original
Paul being the only person I've ever heard of who's worn a fake earpiece.
Yeah, I'll say. Drives the ladies wild, I understand. They can nibble your ear and get extra flavor and texture. But I didn't take it seriously at first, but then I read about Ho Chi Minh. That's part of my book, that's chapter 4. And the CIA and the OSS before that used to use the ears to identify a lot of Asians because the hair color and the eye color was so similar from one Asian to another that they had to glom on to something else. And so they started to pay more and more attention. So it actually came out, there's a book in 1968, I can't remember the title, but I have it. And it actually documents how the OSS and the CIA took the ear evidence very, very seriously, that's how they would identify the people they wanted to keep track of or assassinate or whatever. So yeah, you got to pay attention to that sort of thing. It sounds a little absurd at first. But anyway, where were we when we left off?
That they're two different persons is, in my opinion, conclusive. And I'm interested, I asked Clare, she seems to think that James McCartney, the original Paul, was a better musician than Faul. My opinion is the opposite. I mean, I love all the Beatles music. They're my favorite band. I had a show for I don't know how many years where I began with Day Tripper. I mean, in my breaks, I had Beatles, 4 times during the show for 2-hour shows. And I did that for at least a year and a half. I have a tribute to the Beatles where I play my selection of the 20 best songs they ever wrote. And
sounds like a great show.
Yeah.
So
I'll send it to you, Sterling.
Please do.
But tell me your assessment of the relative merits of the musicians now, of Paul, Faul as musicians.
Yeah, it's kind of complicated, although, I think Clare is wrong to say that there was a noticeable drop-off in quality. And some people try to argue that, well, sure, they maintained quality there, but that's because they were using the songs and maybe some of the original recordings by the original Paul, and they just gave, they didn't change the credit when they had the replacement come in because they didn't acknowledge that he was a replacement. So you had some songs left over. Usually artists who die suddenly like that, they've got a backlog of songs they haven't gotten around to recording yet or something. So the songwriting quality didn't drop off. But then, it went on for years, 66 to 1970 is, 4 solid years of, and they were cranking out an album or two a year with the singles that they put out separately. So I don't agree with Clare on that. And you can get into different styles, but, around that time, a lot of bands changed style. It was the psychedelic era. There's some psychedelic elements on Revolver when the original Paul is still around. But they had a big change in, much more color, and, the imagery was much more psychedelic, starting with Sgt. Pepper, and even with Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever, which are after the Paul death dates too. So I don't believe Claire's right about the drop-off in quality. Now, you could say John really picked it up, but I don't think that really bears out. She thinks that because John, who was going through a lot, he was hooked on heroin, he had his divorce, he had to hook up with Yoko Ono. I don't wish that upon you, Jim. hooking up with Yoko Ono. I think that right there might be enough to throw you off your game. But you're a happily married
I'm
man.
not a big fan of Yoko either, though.
I didn't think so. But I think just getting together with Yoko might be enough to throw you off your game. But going through a divorce with Cynthia, there started to be more financial pressures. They stopped touring. So, and Clare likes to make a big deal out of the moods that John was in, but I don't think you can really use that as evidence to time the death of Paul, or as evidence for the death of Paul, because that guy could have been depressed, not from the death of Paul, but from his divorce, from, maybe there were, as you say, there was an argument supposedly at that recording session where it would have been 66, so it would have been Revolver-ish session, maybe right after Revolver for Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, something in that range there. That was the first one where they had the death date.
My opinion, Sterling, just to interject, is that they became far more experimental and diverse in their music after Paul's demise and replacement.
Right.
I think that Faul took them in whole new directions that they would never have explored otherwise, and that it was a great thing. I mean, I think it actually recreated the band, as it were, and made them much more powerful, in my opinion. I mean, that's not to diminish the early Beatle achievements. I loved all those early songs. They did have, very common themes. Love Me Do, and all the
high school romance,
child romance type thing, which was all wonderful stuff.
Right.
But I think that they became much more formidable force, and their music took on a greater complexity. I was surprised when Clare was claiming she thought these earliest pieces were highly complex. I think not really compared to later, but that's...
No, in fact, the reviewers, the musical experts, said that Sgt. Pepper was more complex, with Aeolian cadences of She's Leaving Home, and the Beatles were laughing like, we don't know what an Aeolian cadence is, for crying out loud. And a lot of that came from George Martin, I'm sure, too, because he was arranging a lot of their stuff. They would hum things or play things on the guitar, and then they didn't read or write music, so George Martin would have to actually write it down. And then when they started to have orchestras play on their stuff, like A Day in the Life, he had to write all that up. So I'm sure he had major input too. And then you look at the late original Paul work, Yesterday from '65, and For No One, and Here, There, and Everywhere from '66 Revolver. Those are very traditional type songs. And then Paul came up with Yellow Submarine too, actually. And that's like a child's song, like a novelty song. So he's not really doing experimental psychedelic stuff, although I understand he did videos like that. He was in that scene, but he wasn't into drugs as much as the others. And he's not the one who had his punch spiked or coffee spiked by Dr. Robert. That was George and John. But Paul was kind of pressured into taking LSD, and then when he was interviewed about it, but it was the replacement Paul, said he took it 4 times. So yeah, he might have been the one taking him in that direction, but you can see from John in songs like She Said, She Said, where they're talking about death, and I Know What It's Like to Be Dead, and it was originally called The Void, Tomorrow Never Knows. Great drumming on that song, by the way, and kudos to Ringo. So Tomorrow Never Knows is very psychedelic by John. So I think John would have led him in that direction, because he was so experimental anyway. But you're right, Paul the replacement Paul might have accelerated that movement. And of course, psychedelic with Penny Lane and psychedelic with Strawberry Fields Forever.
Well, there's all kinds of wonderful stuff there. And Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and on and on. But look, Sterling, I've been very curious whether your book, which has the theme that the evidence that Paul died and was replaced is stronger than the evidence that it did not occur, but you imply it's only a matter of degree, because where I see it as categorical, 2 different men can't have 2 different heights, 2 different shapes and sizes, skulls, different ears,
right,
different teeth, different palates. I'm just surprised Was that a literary decision, or are you making that claim as a matter of logic? Because I just say, look, it's cut and dried. There are two different individuals involved.
Well, there are two different things. One is replacement. I think there's really strong evidence for replacement. And a lot of Hollywood people have replacement. Imagine the demands on them to sign autographs and meet. John Lennon complained bitterly about this, and Lennon remembers that every town they would go to, they'd have to meet the mayor, and the mayor's wife, and the mayor's snotty kids, and it just took so much time. So it makes sense for them to have a double, just to do signing all the stuff, so that they could actually go out and enjoy themselves instead of meeting with all these strangers. And they had nothing to say. Lennon said all they would do is come up to you and say, well, I have your record, and you'd say, oh, well, that's good. So, it's just meaningless conversations. So I do think there were probably all sorts of replacements running around, but there's a sticking point on the death, because if he died, there's insurance money, because by 1966, and we're talking late 66, September to November, they knew that Paul was extraordinarily valuable. He had written many hits. He was the most handsome Beatle. He was still single. He was very marketable quantity, a pop star. So they would have had him insured for probably millions. And then if he dies in an accident, there's a lot of financial incentive to go ahead and declare him dead, but they didn't. So the question is, what would motivate that? And, now if he didn't die, if he just had a nervous breakdown like Syd Barrett of Pink Floyd, or he took some drugs and went off the deep end, or he had this bad ticker, and he got roughed up in Manila, and he got the death threats from the Klan. They have that on tape.
Sterling.
The Klan threatening him. If he just retired and he collected his money, but he was still working behind the scenes, that would explain why the quality didn't drop off, because he's still operating behind the scenes. Or if he didn't die in the car accident, he was just horribly disfigured and was too vain to show his face anymore, he could still work from behind the scenes.
Sterling.
So I can't rule that out. I can't rule that out.
Well, you can't, but I can. I think that's such a stretch. It has the improbability is just great.
Well, then why didn't they claim the insurance money? If they claimed
it was billions, but the band was billions. Once you kill off a founding member of the band, you no longer have the Beatles. Their fans are going to be distraught.
Well, Brian Jones,
you have no idea whether you're going to have continuity. You want to preserve.
Well, right, you don't know for sure, but the Rolling Stones lost Brian Jones in the swimming pool accident or misadventure, and they went on to make more money after Brian, and he was a genius too, Brian Jones. So it can happen. You don't know, and you're also risking criminal liability when these guys are living very nice lives. So Clare might come into play here, because she thinks it's some master cabal by military intelligence. I don't know why they would take such a fascination with a pop group, but there's some people I've heard argue that they wanted the Beatles to promote drugs so they could sell more drugs. They were in Vietnam in the Golden Triangle, and they had to get all that heroin and get all that marijuana and bring it over and sell it. And it's sort of like the Contras, the CIA and the Contras, they would sell drugs to fund the Contras. So I think that's where she's coming from. She thinks, and I think that's a more complicated explanation. I don't know that I can go there yet. But I just don't know why they wouldn't take the money. There are very good replacements available. Eric Clapton would play with anybody who paid him enough money, man. And that guy is a primo guitar. He's much better than George Harrison. And Steve Winwood was out there. He knew Clapton. They could have hired Steve Winwood and Eric Clapton to replace Paul, and they would have been just fine. And they're English too. So Claire, I was telling them about your Tavistock military intelligence theory about, did they want the Beatles to sell drugs so that the CIA could sell drugs to America's youth? Was that what was going on, or what? Why would they want Paul dead and the Beatles under their wing?
Hi, sorry I had to take a break.
Absolutely. A bio break.
Welcome
back. Bio break happens to the best of us.
I hadn't eaten right, and I just had to have something, just a little munch of something.
Well, Conrad Lorenz, the philosopher, said their life boils down to four things: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and fornication. So, but he left out feces and farting.
We've all,
And he
we've all
won.
heard of
He
the,
won the Nobel Prize. That was his theory that won him the Nobel Prize. The
we've
four
all heard of
F's of
the
life.
we've all heard of the 4 F's, Sterling.
Well, leave out the fifth one: feces and farting. You
Well,
gotta have that too.
those are just peripheral effects. They aren't central.
Well, okay, but so Claire, are you into this Tavistock military intelligence? They wanted to use the Beatles to sell drugs to the young generation.
Yeah,
and
lay
they bring
it
in from
on
the
us,
Golden-
Claire. Lay it on
Yeah,
us.
what is that all about?
Well, basically, I was on a man named Dino Costa, who is now going by Patrick Dino Ryan. I was on his show recently. He's seen as a maverick, right-wing, you know, supposedly nasty. He's not nasty person, though. I was on his show recently, and, you know, he got that the Beatles would never have been the same, nor would have been accepted. I mean, they would have been loved, you know, for the sadness, but if they had admitted that Paul died, it simply was not the case that this band would go on. What happened when what I was saying about it became an art band later is that to the degree that you can remake something that was perfect, they did. But no, I mean, the Beatles were the Beatles, and it was very much like for them personally, but also the people they knew them, and also the public. So I really disagree, and I agree with Dino that that this would just never have flown. Like as a band, I think that John would have been just devastated. He was devastated, but he would have been more openly devastated, would have gotten out. So in terms of the Tavistock thing, a lot of people, they point it to one organization. So it's like they say Tavistock, you could say the CIA or MI5, you could say Vatican Intelligence, you could say any number of these sorts of groups, organizations. That Tavistock is a sort of psychology group. It also kind of like some elements in the UN. Again, people toss these terms around, you know, the UN is running things. Yeah, some in it have agendas, but not all of the people are all the time, right? So, you know, we have to think of think tanks. That Tavistock is kind of a think tank. It is a psychiatrist. It's linked to MK Ultra-ish stuff, but it's also a psychology group. So, you know, so anyway,
It's in
I mean,
England. It's in England,
it's
and
in
it's still
England.
around. It's still around.
Yeah, sure, and so is MK Ultra, but not by that name. So the point is, you know, all of that being true, we can get into the ballpark of the kind of problem. So instead of saying like it was Tavistock, what it would have been was a whole consortium, just as Jim was describing earlier about I'm not sure if you were there for that, about
No.
the shooters and the different persons who were happy to engage, and their side was present to witness and participate in, at the time, for Jack Kennedy's death, the biggest operation going on kind of in the public sphere. And so I think that there was probably that sort of thing for Paul, but the actual death looks like it was more of an ambush from the clues, because it looks like a scenario that could be made to seem to the Beatles and their circle as an accident, but which, as I say, doesn't have all of the imprints of an accident. Paul had
Why
been
would they
hanging
be
out.
interested in the Beatles? Why would they take the #1 pop band? What were they trying to do with it? Sell drugs, you know, change fashion, make money through the Beatles somehow? And then Paul wouldn't play along, and they killed him because he wouldn't play along, or what? What happened? What's the story?
Well, that is one line where, if you've read Dave McGowan's book, Laurel Canyon, about the military-industrial interference in our spiritual emotional life. See, the thing about all of this is that there's a spiritual element, and the spirit, or shall we say even just creational world spirit, if you don't believe in the transcendent of spirit, the spiritual element in both of those senses is disrupted on a global level when you harm a leader who's doing good things. You don't just stop what they were doing, you also stop a momentum among the public, let's say question asking or thrill. I mean, the Beatles just had thrill stuff. So and loving. I mean, even when they were down, they were singing it with love to their audience. It was a real engaging perfection of relation to the audience there. So anyway, Paul was hanging out with Mark Lane earlier that year, possibly also in late '65. And Mark Lane, of course, I mean, Jim Fetzer knows how important he was to the Kennedy exposure, both for, yeah, thumbs up to Mark. He was a brilliant lawyer in Washington, but he also was engaged for his services to supposedly represent Oswald Lee, and Lee was never told that he had any representatives interested in him, and then he was murdered as part of that cover-up. So Mark Lane was writing a book that year. He had finished his drafts. He had sent them off to the copywriters, and it came out in August 1966 when the Beatles were still on tour in their last concert series in the USA. But Paul had contacted Mark Lane. They had met at a party. Mark Lane's CIA handler, and Mark Lane talks about that. He says he realized later this guy wasn't really trying to help him edit his book. He was really trying to interfere. That guy was at the party too. So Paul called Mark Lane. According to Mark Lane, we have this in an early source in 1968. We also have it in a later source. Mark Lane repeats it in 2000 and I think 8 or 12 when he wrote his formal
last book, the last
autobiography.
Word,
Yeah,
he says.
he also talked about it on Jim Fetzer's show years ago in about 2009 or 2011 or something, before he died. So anyway, Mark Lane, of course, he had gotten his book out, but before that, Paul had read the proof, and Mark was loath to part with his incredible manuscript because he had hand typed it and it was all perfect. He was a perfectionist. And Paul returned it and talked to him for hours on the phone, and according to Mark, said that he wanted to do something bigger, or shall we say not bigger than the Beatles. The Beatles were wonderful, but in a way, Paul was a kind of a humble guy in certain ways, very natural, and he wanted to do something else in case he ever had children. He wanted to say he had helped. So he would have seen himself more like, I'm in England, I can do something about this cover-up. I can do something because I'm over here in England with all of these connections and all this power structure. But of course, those very connections and power structure would want him dead worldwide if he were to formally lend that support to an expose of the Kennedy assassination. So in a way, Paul's death is another casualty of the Kennedy assassination. But there was more to it because Paul had said he would help with the film. And the film, of course, did start filming that fall in Dallas, and it became really the earliest single and most extensive set of interviews with Dallas witnesses, which has a big cachet with the public to get to see the people, to see they're not crazy, they're just Dallas people. And Mark Lane was going to work on that movie. So all of that is a very short precursor within about 8 months, possibly 12 months, maybe 6 to 8 months with Mark Lane. Now, there's also this whole thing of if people were chomping at the bit to take over the Beatles band for control into the USA, for stopping the Beatles from questioning things, from get the love turned into more arty so that it's more controllable, break it emotionally, which breaks it spiritually. Then there is that element that Bill promoted LSD. He was part of the early attempts to get big LSD concerts going. The first one was in Altamont in 1967.
69, I think.
No, sorry, I didn't mean Altamont. I didn't mean Altamont. I meant it was the first.
Monterey?
It was the Monterey Pop Festival. So he was more of a, you could see him as an agent. He's an agent. Now, whether he was a 9-to-5 agent or he just functions that way, he's that sort of spy in the middle of the mix. Okay, so he promotes that stuff. He's into Satanism. He's into Crowleyism, not only by his own admissions, but by...
Could have been Woodstock you had in mind. Was it Woodstock you had in mind?
No, I was thinking Monterey. It was. Yeah. He was involved right from the very first year Bill was in. He was a sponsor of the Monterey Pop Festival. Now, you can make it all innocent. Money. Yeah, but more than that, he was he was interviewed about LSD. Everyone at the time was unwilling to talk or promote drugs. Even John, I mean, he'd been taking uppers and downers and stuff. But in 67, well, actually just before 67, John got hooked on heroin and on LSD, part of his depression from Paul's dying, as this case would say. But it was promoted to them. And so you have the murder options, and which make perfect sense about why he would immediately have to be killed, be taken out. But then all these other agendas are also chomping at the bit in the explanation. So you can take one or the other. I think it's kind of both.
But isn't the military one, that's a much grander, bigger conspiracy? Don't you run into trouble with Occam's razor or something there?
No,
it's
actually,
not the simplest explanation,
Yeah, well, it's not. See again. Occam's razor isn't just the simpler. It's not positing things that are unnecessary to your discussion. So
Right.
if something is an informed common sense, you have evidence towards it, then those options are perfectly thinkable to make it work, to show that there are other options. So for instance, you can refer to another case, you can say that psychology works this way, you can bring in forensic. So in other words, it can be quite complex, but if it requires the complexity, which is the simplest complexity to make it happen and fit all the evidence. So evidence is always partial, right? You're not going to get every molecule from every event. You're going to get pieces of it.
Can I give 3 examples just to
Sure.
make a bridge to the audience here? If they're wondering, well, why on earth would you think that the military was involved with a bunch of pop groups? It turns out that Jim Morrison, lead singer and writer of The Doors, his father was an admiral during the Vietnam War era and was in charge of a lot of the operations in that area. And then, of course, Jimi Hendrix was an Army paratrooper, and Elvis was drafted into the Army. So they seem to have wanted to disrupt the pop culture scene in various ways, or they had their hooks into some of the leading characters. I mean, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, and Elvis, it doesn't get too much more top-notch than that. And Paul McCartney, you can throw him into the mix. But if they want to get their hooks into pop music, those are 4 of the main guys, and there may be others we don't know about who have connections to the military-industrial complex. So it's not as if it's, McGowan's onto all this stuff and wrote a great book about it. I mean, he had an untimely death some people found suspicious, and there are a lot of suspicious deaths around JFK, over 100 of them. That guy, Richard Belzer, the comedian, he worked together with another guy and put out a book called, I think, The Hit List or something, and he documents over 100 mysterious deaths. And that guy, Robert Grodin, in his book, The Killing of a President, he has about 60 or 70 mysterious deaths in there too. So this may have been the way they would operate, is they'd get their hooks in you, and then if you didn't play ball with them, they would just go ahead and kill you or kill somebody near you to intimidate you and get you to come around to their way of thinking. But Paul must have played along, because by 66, September or November of 66, the Beatles were already a fantastic success, number 1. So he must have played ball with them. They wouldn't have let him go that far if he hadn't been playing ball with them. But then things started to turn explicitly into drugs. And so some people I've heard think that they were pressured into getting into drugs more, and maybe even, and they had reasons to be depressed anyway. There's a divorce and then a new relationship with an avant-garde artist who might have had her own ups and downs emotionally. A lot of artists do. And so maybe John was depressed because of that, but he could have been depressed because of an accident or a murder of Paul too. It's hard to say. And it could be just the effect of the drugs, taking heroin or LSD, who knows what the effect is going to have on you. Sid Barrett had total burnout, and there have been other people who certainly have burned out on drugs too. So it's not totally outlandish, McGowan's thesis, that the Tavistock or military-industrial complex had their hooks in the Beatles and other groups. But an EMI actually used to do some work for the military, the British military. Some of their recordings were done for the military. They had a branch of EMI that worked with the military. So it's not as far-fetched as it may seem initially for the audience's benefit. I know you don't think it's far-fetched, Claire. I don't know what Jim thinks about this military-industrial complex. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Claire. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I don't know where Jim is. I can't see more than one person on my screen on the phone. So,
Oh, I see both of you.
okay. So
Try
he's still here.
gallery. Do you see gallery?
No, it's
Click
on
on
my phone.
gallery.
It's fine. It's fine.
Oh,
I just
okay.
wanted to say Jim Morrison's father was the admiral on the bridge the night of the false flag of that officially brought the U.S. into the Vietnam War. So that is a very high connection.
Yeah.
David McGowan's death was by cancer, which we know can be induced.
Jack
And
Ruby. Jack Ruby, baby.
yeah, and a lot of other
Jack
people.
Ruby died in
But
1967.
yeah, but weeks before his retrial, and he got it just after he got the approval for the retrial, and he said he was basically given it.
Right.
But
He
the
said
point,
it, yeah.
the point I was going to make about Dave McGowan was, it looks like people finished him off because, I mean, he probably got the cancer from inducement, but also he died on Kennedy's death date, November 22nd.
Oh, really?
So
Wow.
yeah, so it wasn't exactly the same time, but probably somebody just, the thing is, you have to think symbolically. You have to think satanic sacrifice element. You have to think numeric gangland stuff. And by the way, the hooking on to 9/11, which has about the date for Paul's death, which doesn't work with the history. The reason that occurred, I explained regarding the date clue and the early disinformation, but it also is not necessary to say that 9/11, we've got that hooked in our brains since 2001. 9 and 11 can be mystical numbers, but so is 13, and it's witchy. So what you have is the satanic witchy element, the 13 and the midnight. So I think that's more where the Paul date goes. But yes, the military, and I mean, again, we're not putting down all people in the military or the CIA or whatever, but I would say that I would be the kind of person that wouldn't want to go into them, because you are under security oaths. You are going to see things that you think are bad for the country. You are having to think that your company of soldiers or CIA members or FBI members, that they are beyond or can fudge the law, and what happens here stays here. What happens in the CIA stays in the CIA, that kind of thing. So the idea of positing these things, it doesn't go against Occam's razor, because all of the material supports are there to do it. So it's like saying I can't have an egg because there's no such thing as a chicken. Well, if there's a chicken, certainly possible you might have an egg. It becomes far less stupid to posit that there would be this thing called an edible egg.
If you have the evidence, this doesn't violate Occam's razor. If you have something unexplained that you explain with that, it doesn't violate Occam's razor. But it is a bigger, grander theory, and so people kind of make that question. So
yeah, they love to do that.
Well, anyway, what does Jim think about all this military stuff? You were in the military. And my daughter, by the way, is on active duty. She's a corpsman on active duty at Walter Reed right now, a corpsman and a hospitalman. So I'm not running down the military either. My father was in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, and my daughter is on active duty right this moment as a corpsman and hospitalman at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. But Jim, what do you think about this military thing?
Well, I've not been much drawn toward it, Sterling. I've just not seen evidence compelling me in that direction. But on the other hand, I'm willing to concede that you and Clare have investigated aspects of Paul McCartney's death with which I'm unfamiliar. Let me say, this has been an utterly fascinating exchange, with the two of you in particular having very interesting and different takes on aspects of this. I want to give each of you the opportunity for a closing statement, as it were. Clare, you go first. Take 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, well, we were going to actually discuss Sterling's book. So what I wanted to say was regarding the book, and again, this is not personal, but for me, critical thinking ought to be used to explain not only being able to present objections as one goes, but actually build up a case and fully understand it. And to try out people who claim that they can see a whole case or part of a case. For instance, if I had been writing the book on Kennedy's death, I would have immediately gone to Jim and actually learned his way before I don't mean with no questions in my mind as I'm going through, but I would have apprenticed myself. I would have learned it first. Even if it was totally wrong, I would learn what the claims are that people are making and why they make them fully, and really try to think them through. What I saw in the book was less evidence of that. So for instance, you open with a little sort of, I found it fairly fuzzy or wishy-washy statements. Then you went through a whole bunch of clues. Most of what you say about different clues do not have a full-on PID explanation for them. You're mostly giving caveats. I'm fine with caveats. I'm often criticized for giving too many caveats. I'm talking about being able to do that, fully understand the case. And then at the end, you said, now this is of your first chapter, which is really a book in itself. It's a book or volume within a physical book. So chapter 1 is the book we're discussing. I mean, that's really kind of, if we could
Right.
equivocate the term. So at the end of that book inside the physical volume, you say it's like 51%, think he died, but because of all these clues, and I found that the facility with the case evidence wasn't there. I also, then there's an appendix at the end of the other chapters, which are almost individual long essays or books or whatever you want to call them, segments. There is a super recognizer, which is, for the audience doesn't know, there are people who are calling. This was an academic who said this, that people who have a greater ability to recognize something, we're going to call them super recognizers. So there can be super audio recognizers, super visual recognizers. A dog is a super nasal recognizer. In other words, that you have a tendency to be able to do certain tasks more often, more correctly, under more circumstances. Okay, so this person that you seem to have paid to do it, who claims that she's been through some kind of, I guess, testing or works with the police, that she first of all, I know this from interchange with you, was not given key pieces of evidence that show the differences more extremely, which is very important to do. Now, we can call that a prejudicing. We can look, when I look at something, I try to stay with it as long as possible. I listen to all the weird videos, all the weird stuff, all the official stuff. I get a sense of what everybody's saying. That's important, to get just what's out there, even if it's weird. And then I get familiar with what are those key balance points, and then I really think it through more and put it forward. So I think that a super recognizer needs to have key pieces of evidence given, and for which, if you ever do it again, I would be perfectly willing to suggest some. You don't even have to credit me. I'm not into credit. It's not the point. I usually don't get
Happy to
credit
credit
anyway.
you. That's not an
Well,
issue.
whatever. I mean, my point is, it's not from ego that I'm saying that. I'm saying with great familiarity, there are ones I would choose to make them more aware just in their super recognizability, which is like giving a dog a better sample, or giving a physical instrument a better sample. It doesn't mean that when samples are admixed, there's no pork chop in with the egg for the dog to smell. But it is far less, it's far less differentiable, even to a super recognizer, even if they are trying to be. And I know this because I've worked with this case for a while, and I spent most of my childhood looking at and thinking about drawings. So I would sit there and say, why did this Rembrandt drawing, like, how did it convey a tree? What is it, not only about sizing and so on, which is what the forensic scientists in Wired Italian did, is like, what are the measurements on this photo? But also considering photo doctoring, which they did not. So I'm very familiar with the broad base, but also the key divergent, we could call them looks, and they're not measurable because they're not always exactly the same angle, but there's an exaggeration under certain lighting conditions or so on of features. So what I will say is this, is that I found it wishy-washy, not because it did not present any evidence that PID uses, and not because it said any objections from PIA, which is Paul is alive, but rather because not being absolutely grounded in both sides, one doesn't know the intense objections, and one would not tend to give a super recognizer those aspects that were given, and then which she chose. So 7 out of 9 that she chose were Paul. 2 were Bill at his best and far away and during a concert and so on. So what we have is, it's not where it's not where the very best examples are. And just a final point to the audience, you will find lots of photos that would confuse you. In other words, I say this as someone who knows there is Bill and knows there is Paul. Bill was very good right around 1968. They got it kind of perfect as they're going to get. They also doctored a lot of photos. Sometimes his differences show up quite a bit. A lot of times they don't. So it's not about whether they are somewhat similar ever or the same because of doctoring, but rather, are there divergences, and do they show the kind of divergence that is not natural, period? And that's what you pull out of the sample to calibrate your mental instrument, right? So that's what I would say about it. I mean, I'm glad that you felt that you wanted to contribute. I just felt it was premature, and I am happy to speak to you, and I did enjoy being here, and I'm sorry I took that, whatever it was, 10 minutes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be away.
That's okay.
Sterling,
Let me, yeah.
you get the last word, my friend.
Okay, let's hope I don't get knocked off again by the military-industrial complex. Well, what you're calling wishy-washy, I call nuanced and sophisticated. So, I rely on these Italian pathologists who see the physical differences, and I say the problem is that you need to have replication, and to my knowledge, nobody has replicated their studies in the same kind of detail that they did. So that's why I'm a little more nuanced about it. If another study comes out that confirms all their findings, then I think, I'm gonna be much bolder. And I have, what I do in the book that's never been done before apparently is I have 166 clues with, some discussion, like a paragraph for each one. Sometimes they're mentioned in other books and you got to pull them all together, but I did that for the reader. And the other novel thing that I do in the book is that I have the super recognizer, as you point out, and I don't have control over her. I just paid her fee, and she has law enforcement experience. And she says in the analysis in the appendix of my book, it ends my book, that it's not science, but it is scientifically based in some sense, because these super recognizers take tests to see if they have an ability to recognize faces. And you can take the test too. Some of them are online. And if you score high enough, maybe you can sell your services as a super recognizer to law enforcement. And they go through, videos in London. They have all these video cameras up, and they can spot terrorists because they're going through the feed of it. And so there's a practical use for it. So it's not just fooling around in art school or something. This is like practical real world ability that these people have. I did give them a close-up. To me, one of the strongest pieces, this is why it's also nuanced and sophisticated instead of gung-ho for Paul is Dead, is that I was first taken seriously with Paul is Dead when I saw that Fool on the Hill segment from Magical Mystery Tour film that was broadcast on December 24th, 1967. And it clearly showed, by zooming in, the close-ups of his eyes and then zooming back out again, that the replacement Paul had light green eyes. And everybody knows that Paul had brown eyes. You look at all the newspaper accounts, and his bubblegum cards say he has brown eyes, chocolate brown eyes. And you can't change your eye color. And it was before you had colored contact lenses. That came in about 1978. This is 1967. But then I remembered I had an album from 1964 that said what the Beatles' eye colors were, at least some of them. It's called The Beatles Story. It's a 2 LP set, mainly spoken word, but it's got a few musical elements in it. And I listened to the Paul McCartney part, and what did they say his eye color was from 1964? Hazel. And it turns out if you look up what hazel eyes means, it means it can take on different colors, everything from brown to green. So that really weakened the case a little bit. There was a physical thing that I was going to rely on and be gung-ho about, but I had to be more nuanced and sophisticated about it. And then when the super analyzer came in and said she saw that it was the same person in all these photos, I had to kind of be more chastened than I would otherwise. But still, there's a lot of evidence that he was replaced. A lot of evidence.
May I have one minute just to say a couple of quick points in succession? I'm not to go on and take over. Can I just have 1 minute?
Yeah, but we're closing, Claire. You may say
Okay,
a few
so-
more words. Yeah.
So the very best time when the green eyes are shown absolutely clearly and in proper lighting is during the Strawberry Fields Forever video, when they deliberately showed it. All others have been somewhat browned out. Hazel can mean greenish, brownish. It also can mean hazelnut. Paul's eyes were more of a hazelnut brown. It's probably what he meant. Also, I certainly didn't mean that nuance cannot be in there, or also all kinds of other ideas, but rather that if not also handling the highest arguments of one side, then it's not just nuanced, it would be more wishy-washy. That's what I was getting at.
Well, I can put out another edition of the book, Claire, and
I
can
hope you
change
do. I hope you
the
do.
Kindle edition. I can make changes right now.
Sterling,
I hope you do.
Sterling, yeah, thank you, Claire and Sterling, both. You've been excellent guests. I think, Sterling, you want to just remember the principles of logic, that two different persons one person cannot have two different properties that are permanent properties of an adult at the same time. We've got two persons that have different teeth, different palates, different ears, different shape and size of skull, different heights. They are unmistakably not the same person. It's not close. It's not
No, it isn't.
subtle. It's blatant.
Well, I said there's a replacement.
categorical.
The question is death. Replacement's one thing, and death is another thing. They're two different
Oh
things.
yeah. You can, as you and Claire have both been going on about differences about how he died.
I agree with replacement. There's definitely
The point
replacement.
I'm making is these are two different persons, and
Yeah.
you can review the evidence in the piece that I've cited right here, archived right here, issues of fake news, issues of identity, where I go through all the evidence to show these are two different persons. All the rest, of course, I leave to the two of you. And I conclude today by thanking you both. You've been simply excellent. I enjoyed this conversation thoroughly from beginning to end. So this is Jim Fetzer on the Fetz Presents, thanking Sterling Harwood, who has a new book, The Greatest Mystery of the Beatles, available from Amazon.com, and Clare Kuehn, an extraordinary student of Faul, thanking them for being here, and all of you for watching, very active in the chat room tonight. About 150 comments altogether, I'd say. Very good show. Thank you both. Thanks for being here. Thanks, everyone, for coming
Thanks, Jim.
tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Just terrific. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.